of identities and the variety of lived experiences that we've had. I think for me, the other part about it is that in addition to making sure that we set up spaces that reflect these different identities, I think they also need to be spaces that provide us an opportunity to learn about those identities, to learn more about those cultures, to learn more about the different experiences that people have, such that we're not fixated on the very sort of technocentric learning components of it. I think it was good this morning. There was some discussion around personal expression, and I think some of this gets back to Seymour Papern's work on the power of big ideas, and really setting up space where people have the opportunity to explore those big ideas. And for me, that's one of the other things that I think is super important, and allowing for the big ideas that kids have, the big ideas that participants have within these spaces to really be infused within those spaces, and let that identity, let those values, and let those interests really be what starts to take over and start to define those spaces, instead of what I feel like has happened in other situations where making comes in, and part of what we're trying to do is have other people fit into an existing mold of making.
Thank you, Marcelo. So we'll go to Luciano now. So quick introduction, Luciano, and then your response.
Thank you, Paulo, for inviting me for this debate. I'm Luciano Meira. I'm from northeastern Brazil, the city of Recife. I'm a professor of psychology at the Federal University of Pernambuco, which is my state. I'm also co-founder of an edtech here in Recife. It's called Joy Street. We develop learning platforms for various development of skills in basic schools and even corporations. Okay, so what's my research connected all to this, and how I see the situation in Brazil right now in face of all this we're living globally. We very much lagging behind everyone else, I guess, in several ways, especially if we take access, the very basics of access, from access to connectivity, to equipment, and digital resources. In terms of how those things are organized in schools, so there are very basic issues related to how we create innovative practices that uses these resources in meaningful ways. So we even, I had troubles getting to this room. And I'm not in a very wealthy place of my city. So you can only imagine how, what the situation is or looks like for the vast majority of our population. So this is one issue. The second one is that very recent research shows that at least 80% of teachers don't feel familiar with digital resources or even the very basic equipment that they sometimes have in schools. That's 80% of teachers who should be, in programs for teacher development that we have not been able to provide as a nation. So we have, here and there, some offering of this, but educational faculties or educational courses have very much focused on the theory of education that is not connected to practice, and so we are trying to rethink the way we get teachers to think about their own profession and how we can innovate in those practices.
Thanks a lot, Luciano. So so we'll go to Leah now, and then Filiberto. And I realized maybe I should change the color of the thing, so I'll just show a green thing. It's like red is a bit, you know, incompatible with the theme of the panel. So, anyways, Leah.
Hey, hello everyone. My name is Leah Beakley. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of New Mexico. And I guess when I think about constructionism and equity, one of the main things that comes to mind for me, particularly in the context of the United States, is I feel like it's so important for those of us who care about learning and equity to engage very deeply with the public school system, even though that is very difficult and often seems very challenging to reconcile maybe the traditional kind of school institutions with kind of constructionist philosophy or just kind of liberal kind of ideas about education broadly. Those things that can be quite challenging. But if we want to reach like truly diverse populations of kids in the United States, like we have to engage with the public schools. And many of you on this panel and many of you present, like already do that in beautiful and fantastic ways. I say this as much as anything as an admonishment to myself. And I feel like something that has been very lacking in where my own attention has been. And I guess this is something that causes me personal angst. Like, how can we, engage in a really truly meaningful way with public schools? And that unless we're doing that, we're not really reaching the audience that we maybe most want to be reaching. And I, as a follow-on to that, I wanted to kind of say two things, kind of borrowing from things that both Paula and Marcelo said, which is that our engagement with communities that are different from ourselves, I think that those are important. We have to always remember that those are our sources of learning as much as, and probably more than they are sources of us to like deliver our wisdom, right? And so that is an important thing that I think is critical. And then also, I loved what Paula said about remembering that learning is a cultural experience, and keeping that at the forefront of our minds, I think is so important, and something that is not always, given the emphasis that it should have. Okay.
Thanks, Leah and Filiberto.
Cha, Sesikwa, Kimbon. With the permission of the guardians of these lands and the lands where I come from, Mampurepecha from Central Mexico, Michoacan, and I've been here in Coast Salish territories, more specifically here in Duwamish lands, what people know as Seattle, for the last 10 years. And for the last 8 years, I have engaged in ISTEAM, Indigenous STEAM Camp, with my colleague, Megan Bang, here in the Northwest, and she's now at Northwestern. You probably know that. And in our work with youth and families outside of the schooling context, I think one of the things that has emerged for us, or we've known about, but I think it's more central to what we have been doing, has been expanding our understandings and our notions of what it means to make, who makes, and towards what ends. And so we kind of think of making as being connected to a longer tradition, and specifically to longer traditions of making around original technologies, namely weaving and clay making. And so if we take up that perspective, we're in a very critical moment, to reflect and reconsider what maker education can be. And for us, as we think about like the issue is that tension of you know, can maker education be also about restoring human relationships with each other, but also restoring relationships with other living things. And, you know, if we see what's happening in the world, there's a great need for that. And I think the other thing that I'll say is I think that what I'm raising are tensions that we see, right, in terms of you know, what the more typical maker movement, you know, kind of values and kind of how it frames itself. I think the other thing that I'll add is just is that for us, the making is also a move towards larger goals. So we think of it as being connected to indigenous resurgence. So it's not just making for innovation. It's also about contributing to the broader goals that are important for Native and indigenous communities, whether they're here in the U.S. or in other parts of the world. We see that work as also connected to the broader goals of sovereignty, self-determination, autonomy, nation building more broadly. And so I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks a lot, Filiberto. And so I think so I'll just say a little bit about how we'll structure the rest so that the audience, you know, knows. So there's another question that I'll ask the participants, and then we'll have about 15 minutes towards the end for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, you know, you can use the Q&A functionality to send them to us, and then I'll read them to the, if you want to ask someone in particular, you know, make sure you write in your question who or if it's a question for the whole panel, that's okay as well. But so my second question is, so, you know, 2020, on top of being, you know, one of the most horrific years in history, also marks about 50 years of the Logo programming language, 50 years of the Paulo Freire's book, A Pedagogia do Oprimido, 20 years of the Fab Lab movement approximately, 15 years of the Maker Faire approximately. So it's a lot of traditions that are coming together, you know, in the wider maker movement and maker education. And so we've been at this for a while, you know, for 15, 20, 50 years. And so the question, like, what is the contribution of constructionism, of critical pedagogy, of social cultural perspectives to maker education, and how those contributions can be guides for the next decade in making, and also how can we combine them in productive ways? So this time we'll kind of invert the order. So we'll start with Leah and then go to Filiberto.
Yeah, gosh, there's a lot to take in and a lot to reflect on and think about here. In terms of, I'll address like a smaller subset of that question, in terms of what constructionism has brought to making and kind of the maker movement within education. I feel like the best and most important component that constructionism brings to those kind of efforts and communities is the emphasis on kind of student agency and engagement and interest. And that, I feel, is something that sometimes we can lose sight of, or when we talk about kind of maker education, but it's something that is so key to what is wonderful about kind of building personally meaningful projects, that connection to, you know, what people or what humans just feel excited about and, you know, interested in. So that kind of key focus on like individual agency and individual kind of excitement and engagement, I think is maybe the most valuable thing that constructionism has brought to making, and in particular brought a really strong kind of articulation and almost framework that we can use to think about those things in the context of making. And I'll leave it at that.
Filiberto, you want to?
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. I think you know, one of the places that I guess I want to kind of think through is specifically critical pedagogy and critical perspectives broadly. I think from my perspective, I think one of the things that critical pedagogy, I recall reading that book as a teenager in Los Angeles in Boyle Heights. I was a part of a literacy campaign then. This is back in the early 90s. And I think one of the, looking back to that experience and everything that has unfolded, you know, for me in the subsequent years, is that I think, you know, critical pedagogy and these perspectives have opened ways to consider other ways of being and doing in the world to make those more visible. And I think, you know, prior to that, you know, those of us who grew up in countries where there was a lot of repression, you know, to be able to bring new ideas and other forms of thinking about things, you know, it posed a large threat to, you know, whatever the establishment was. And so I think, you know, for me, I think a lot about those contributions and what it means for people who have been historically in the margins to have a place and have agency in different spaces, to have a voice and an opinion, and to openly advocate, you know, for new epistemologies and cosmologies and ways of seeing and understanding the world. And I think in the Native Indigenous context, this is very specifically from our histories, from our knowledges, and from our realities. And going back to the point I had made earlier, I think, you know, it makes us consider those questions, right? Like, you know, maker education towards what end, and what does maker education, you know, propose to transform? And so I'll just end there with really quickly with something that I think is an important point to make is I think one of the things that it brings to the center, and that's a part of those critical perspectives and critical pedagogy, which has origin in Marxist thought, is thinking and understanding around materiality. And I feel like that also kind of helps us, or it should help us think a lot about sustainability and how we think about the materiality and the materials we're using and in which context. And so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Filiberto. So Paula, then Marcelo, and then we'll go to a more like open answer kind of thing. So this is the last more like going in order kind of thing. But so Paula, Marcelo.
Okay. One of the things that's just really exciting at this moment, sort of at this, looking at the integration, that how we're talking about what constructionism is right now. I just want to highlight that the fact that we're talking about constructionism as being integrated with ideas around critical pedagogy, as being integrated with ideas around how learning is a cultural process, is a fact that we've made movement over the last 20, 30, 40 years, right? And so going forward, I try to think about, and I know that that's where we're all at in this panel, is trying to think about, well, when we're putting those things together, what is that going to look like, right? And I tend to see a lot in sort of the interactions and the designs that happen within makerspaces. And one of the, a little story that comes up is when I was working with the design of the fabrication space at the Museum of Science and Industry a while ago. We had a group of kids that came in, and a young Latina young woman, was learning how to use the laser cutter. And so we were showing them how to make these little things. And then she decided she wanted to make a rose. She wanted to cut out a rose as a present for her grandmother for Mother's Day. And so she did that, and it was a nice big little plaque. It was really pretty. And then she said, oh, well, if I make this smaller and I can make a lot of them, like I could fit maybe 20 of them into this sheet of acrylic, then I could make them as presents for my class. Right? I saw a lot in what she was learning about what fabrication is there that was connected to who she is in the world. And I think those are the ways of seeing that we want to bring to what we do in makerspaces and why we think about fabrication being important to kids. It's not just about teaching them how to use a machine. It's about teaching them how to take up those ideas that are involved in using that technology to be who they are in the world. And those are the places where I think we can see those intersections of critical pedagogy and what constructionism originally was, is it came out of constructivism, and the futures that we need to create with these technologies where learning as a cultural process is involved in how we think about developing the technologies.
Thanks, Paula. Marcelo.
So I mean, I think for me, I'm gonna jump back to big ideas. I think one of the things that really stands out to me about constructionism is this power of big ideas. And in many respects, I see critical pedagogy as a big idea. It's allowing people to look and see the world in different ways, recognize the injustices that are going on. And so one of the ways I think about constructionism, and I think about maker spaces, and the focus on materiality, the physicality, the creating of these shareable objects, is providing opportunities for people to instantiate some of those ideas related to critical pedagogy, instantiate their ideas for how they want to see a different world, and to subsequently be able to share those and discuss those with family members, with peers, with colleagues. So I think that's one of the things that I really see about bringing these areas together, and how I see them as being related. I think the other really important thing that I hope to continue to see, really kind of building somewhat on what Paula had said, is bringing a critical lens to making, bringing a critical lens to Fab Labs, to constructionism. Because, constructionism, as I understand it, is not meant to be this thing that's static, right? I don't think Seymour came up with the constructionism and said, all right, this is it. This is constructionism, now just leave it as it is, don't touch it. I think the idea is that the participants, the observers, the quote unquote makers, are supposed to be engaging in using a critical lens to really investigate and interrogate even the work that they're doing, and even what it means to participate and learn within the context of constructionism. So for me, I think there's a neat intertwining of how these areas really build on each other, and really kind of can be set up to be used in conversation with one another, and to kind of help those who are participating in them continue to help them both evolve and sort of surface new ideas, and surface and also recognize new ways of knowing, and also return to, I think, older ways of knowing that have been that society has tried to erase, or society has tried to push aside.
Thanks, Marcelo. Luciano / Freire, your take.
Yes, I'll try. I believe the question of creativity is one that a very powerful one within the field of constructionism. And we understand here creativity very much related to innovation. And there are, I would say, 4 dimensions of the issue of creativity that I think are especially important to organizing schools and the students' and educators' life. The first one is this: to be creative, you have to trust one another. So the building of trust and the relations between teachers and students are especially important for schools, obviously, and within constructionism. The second dimension, I think, is what we call perspectivation, this active, this ability to active listen to the other. So that's another dimension of creativity. That's to me, that's very important. Also developing at the same time technical knowledge, but also the ability to transit between different fields of knowledge, and so to be able to metaphorically build narratives that are engaging to students and teachers. And finally, do all this in some sort of harmony, which is an aesthetic value to schools. So I think creativity is one powerful idea that connects constructionism to classrooms. And I would emphasize at least these 4 dimensions on how to get creativity to be fostered and to be an important center of how schools treat knowledge and learning.
Thanks, Luciano. So before we go to the questions from the audience, and there are like a few kind of piling up here, I want to ask one last thing, and you can just go in any order. You don't all have to reply, but this goes back to my time in Brazil. I'm from Brazil, just like Luciano, and there was a time when I was in college, and Luciano might confirm that I mean, academia in Brazil is very inspired by the kind of European continental perspectives, and Marxism is was a very important was a pillar of many disciplines, and of course Freire's work and all of that. But there was a point in Brazilian academia where I mean, that's my opinion. Some of these discussions of social justice and kind of what to do about that, it became so much of an academic discussion about tiny little different interpretations of a sentence written by someone and all of that, and which is great in for academics. That's what we do. But in some ways it kind of lost touch with reality, in a way, a reality of schools, the reality of students, what was happening around. And so, I mean, my question is, how do we make sure that this discussion about equity and making and constructionism and all of those progressive, how do we make sure that we don't get caught in the kind of endogenous academic debates and the kind of tiny different interpretations of a sentence or a word? And how do we keep connected with those populations, with schools, with our students and teachers and all of that? Because I think that's a really important, from what you just said, that's a really important thing, right?
May I comment on that?
Sure.
I think usually teachers, even in university settings, usually they bring problems to the youngsters, the students. If we want students to think about their communities and society at large, we have them to pose problems for themselves, observing, listening to their communities, and being able to define and refine problems, to build solutions to those problems they themselves can observe. So there are, of course, ways to do this. We have a course here, it's called Psychology and Innovation, and we have people from different areas in multidisciplinary teams to do precisely that through along with a challenge-based learning path. So there are, the way to do this, Paul, I think, is to put kids to define problems, refine problems, and ideate solutions.
Thanks, Luciano. Filiberto.
Yes, I think what you bring up is a very important question, and I think the way that I kind of interpret that question is that I think deep inside of that, there's also a question about ethics and what our ethics are. And I think if we're talking about the influences of critical pedagogy and Paulo Freire, then conversations about power and power relations should always be at the center of our work and our proposals and the work that we're doing with community members. So if we're not bringing that into these spaces, then I don't know that we can say that we've been influenced, right, by Freire in particular. And I think even deeper down into that into that space of power relations, he was very explicit in naming the kinds of power relations. He was talking about those who are oppressed, those who are oppressing, oppression, liberation. And so I think it's there. It's there for us to think about and consider in how we do the work, whether that's happening. I think the context in which we're in also has a lot to do, right? And what is it that's shaped, people's formation into the fields? I think there's something to ask and question around that.
Thanks, Filiberto.
I was just going to add, I think to Filiberto's comment, I mean, I think there needs to be more intentionality and more explicitness around here are the commitments that we're trying to bring into this space, or that we are trying to represent as we're working with different organizations. To equally be, and I think Luciano, this is part of what you're getting at, is needs to be more space for communities, for to be able to be the ones at the table making the decisions. I think this goes back to the comments around who has the power. That many cases, as the academics working with an organization, no matter how much we want to say otherwise, we are the ones coming in from a position of power. And unless we put explicit measures in place, even if we put explicit measures in place that say, hey, I want to defer as much decision-making power to you as I can, we still have to recognize that in many respects, the power does still reside with us. To be able to even make that decision means that we already had the power in the first place. So I think there really has to be a lot of intentionality around, explicitly pulling ourselves back and leaving space for the organizations, for the communities to be the ones that are talking about the questions of why, the questions of how, and also making sure that we are not projecting onto a community a set of values that we think that they should have, or a set of values that we think are important for them. Because I think that can be one of the other things that kind of comes into play, even in the best intentions, that we have a misunderstanding, or we just don't really understand what those values should be and what the communities actually.
Yeah, I'll just build off of that, because that's beautiful, and it leads me to thinking about how working with teachers, you're not going to get the ideas. Teachers are not going to engage with you if you don't come into working with them with a sense of respect and a sense that you want to learn from them about how they're teaching and why they're teaching the way that they're teaching it. Even if you have something to offer them, right? You have to set up a relationship where they see that you value who they are in the world. And that helps them to put themselves more in a place of learning with you. And I think that that is a way of extending some of the visions around what constructionism could do from a critical perspective that I think Seymour really would embrace. I think that's one of the directions that he wanted things to go, was to have people really work together to learn about learning and teaching, and think about what kinds of tools could offer to, what the kinds of technological tools that were being developed could offer to teaching becoming a different kind of experience. But if you don't say, okay, we're working together to think about this, teacher, researcher, designer, we're all trying to figure out this problem together, and that can open us up to new ways of thinking, then you fall into this power hierarchy that's controlling things.
Thanks, Paula. We have a bunch of questions kind of pouring in here. So I mean, they are mostly for all of you. So I would try to ask and then ask one of you to start, and then we kind of, if other people want to pitch in, that's fine, so that we can answer as many as possible. So I think one that I'll ask Luciano, because it talks about Samba schools, is from Cynthia Solomon, who is the keynote tomorrow. She said, makerspace seem to be welcoming environments for growing a Samba school kind of culture. How would you encourage this?
Paulo, audio wasn't so good for me, so I didn't quite catch the question. Sorry.
You're muted, Paulo.
Sorry, makerspaces seem to be welcoming environments for growing a Samba school culture. How would you encourage this?
Wow, I I wouldn't know how to begin to answer this. I guess this is related to the issue of creativity and how to, as I said, transit between different fields of action. So the idea of building metaphors, which has been studied for a long time already in cognitive psychology and linguistics, to me is a very powerful idea to be building these different kinds of environments in schools. But we are, as teachers, I mean, we are not used to even read from outside our fields. So we should be reading art. We should be watching much more movies than we usually do. Because this is the kind of thing that brings this ability to travel between different fields and ways of life. So bringing art to schools, I think it's a great way. It's a very powerful way to foster these kinds of environments. I hope I understood the question correctly.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Luciano. So I'm going to ask a question, this next one for Filiberto. So this is from Gaia. Last time I got her name right. Let's hope I can do. So Gaia Trijayatirtha from UPenn. She asked, one of the aspects of power differences between groups of people is access to materials and what kinds of artifacts are valued in the broader narrative. Wonder how the panelists navigate such tensions in the work to be liberatory for marginalized folks.
That's an excellent question. I think one of the things that we're always negotiating, in particular in our projects, I think is that tension, right? Of you know, what are we trying to roll out here? What are we trying to do? And I think we orient ourselves to the broader goals. I think one of the things that we're clear about in our work is that we don't want to reproduce, or our work takes place during the course of the summer. And then we continue some of that work with families and youth throughout the year. And I think one of the things that we're clear about is that we don't want to actually replicate, you know, school and schooling and the activities that are familiar there. We're working from a different place. And I think, you know, what we are always clear about is I think it's important to have something that anchors you. And for us, the thing that always anchors us is it's not so much as, it's not a question about what's the contribution to makerspace necessarily. The contribution or the thought that we kind of anchor ourselves in is the work that we're doing connected and grounded in land-based pedagogies. And if it's not, then maybe it's not a worthy cause, because part of, you know, the way we conceptualize this is learning with and from the land. And that's true for the mathematics, for the engineering aspects of it, and for the making parts of it. And so that's the anchoring point for us. So obviously it's very different to kind of negotiate that, within a more formalized school district or a school system. And there have been attempts, I think, and there are folks doing some of that work. But our work is mostly kind of situated outside of that more kind of formalized space.
Thanks, thanks, Filiberto. So this one, I mean, if you feel strongly that you need to comment, let me know. Not like in the presidential debates, but just kind of gently, I don't know, Luciana, if you saw those debates, but you're pretty brutal. But anyway, so this other one is I'll ask Paula. So it's for anonymous attendee. As a student trying to understand foundation theories of learning, etc., how does the constructionist community or you envision the role of culture in learning and making? And I mean, there's a second part, like what are the similarities between constructivist versus social culture perspectives? But I mean, let's focus on the first part first, the role of culture in from a constructionist perspective in learning and making. You're muted, Paula.
Now I'm unmuted, right? Okay, so yeah, this is a great question. I think that one of the ways I think about this is that if you think about what constructionism really is intended to be, it includes sociocultural perspectives. But because of the ways that people have sort of glommed onto the idea that constructionism means making things with materials means that you're making things in your mind. So they sort of take that sort of nice way of sort of holding on to some of the key parts of it. It doesn't get at the complexity that's involved, right? So if you're making things, something that's important to you, say for instance, in some of the tinkering after school program work that was done at the Exploratorium, my colleague Megas Pude, all of the projects that they did were very constructionist in the sense that she would give the kids materials and they would build and they would make things, but she structured the time so that kids had an opening circle where they could all talk with each other about ideas that were related to the project, where adults could come in and introduce them to things. They would go off and they would do their work in groups and be able to have adults that were talking with them and teens that were working with them, and she created in a culture of really interacting around the ideas was created in that space. And then at the end, they would come back and share their ideas. So that was a way that constructionist work happened through the sociocultural connection, through recognizing that learning collaboratively is an important way to learn. Right? And so that's where I feel like now we're at a point of trying to make the sociocultural that is within constructionism more explicit. But I do believe that in the way that Seymour and Edith can develop those ideas, it wasn't intended to be this sort of separate debate like a Vygotsky versus Piaget debate, which is a false debate also, right? It was how do you emphasize the ideas that can be built through the process of building in community. And so that's where those ideas come together.
Thanks, Paula. And I think we have time for two more. So maybe I'll do Marcelo, ask Marcelo and Leah. So one is, this is for Marcelo, and say from Jaime Valim Mansan. Marcelo, what is, according to your research, the major challenges for students with disabilities to access the possibilities and knowledges on making in U.S. schools?
So I guess I think there's multiple layers to the challenges. At the most sort of, I'd say, surface layer is actually physically trying to navigate maker spaces can oftentimes be challenging for someone who may have a motor impairment, who is wheelchair bound. Someone who has a visual impairment, like there's typically not multimodal navigation systems that are set up so that someone can easily navigate that space. And many spaces sadly, and I think this is actually part of the Silicon Valley kind of hacker culture, is these spaces are messy. You walk inside and just things are just sort of strewn about. So I'd say at a very surface level, issues of navigation. I think at a next level, when you look at many of the interfaces, the actual technologies that someone's supposed to use to do computer-aided design, for example, those are primarily set up with an assumption that someone has full vision. Many of them are not screen reader compatible. Many of them assume you have full fine motor control, meaning that you've got very good control over your hands and can, use a keyboard and mouse really, really easily. But at the same time, I'd actually go beyond that and say, I think there's a certain level of assumption around what it means to be creative, and sort of suggesting that someone who may have a certain cognitive impairment cannot exercise the same kind of creativity, or rather to say that the kind of creativity that they may exercise is not valuable. It doesn't fit into the paradigm of what it means to be a maker and to practice as a maker. So which is to say that I think the issue is multifold. I mean, it starts off at this very sort of surface level and like, let's think about the space, but I think it also gets fundamentally into some of the perceptions and some of the values that we have around what it means to be creative, what it means to design and invent, that really goes much deeper than just thinking about the layout of the physical space.
Thanks, Marcelo. So it seems like we'll be right on time for Leah and then a quick wrap up. But again, the anonymous attendee with great questions asks, with the exception of this extraordinary group of educators and thinkers, I'm disappointed in how little progress constructionism has made over 50 years in public schools. Why haven't we made more progress? And what opportunities does this moment in time offer us to progress? I think Leah's call for action for working public schools might be part of the answer. So we have like 2.5 minutes, okay, Leah, for that.
Okay, gosh, lots of thoughts here. I do think it's important for those of us who are interested in the ideas and working in this space to engage deeply with public schools. I think that's key. I also want to shift the conversation a bit. And I think that there are lots of, I think constructionism in many ways is seen by our community as a broad kind of theory of learning. And it's seen by very few people outside of our community in that way. And I think that's for good reason, actually. And I think that we should be more critical within our community of constructionism. I think there are so many beautiful ideas and articulations in constructionism. They've certainly guided my own work, but I think there are profound limitations to it that we should be cognizant of and to be more open about. So one that I would identify is constructionism as articulated by Pepper. It was very, very much about mathematics and computer science, and that's kind of it. And we can extrapolate and take a broader perspective, but really he was talking very, very specifically, I think, about mathematics and computer science. So for example, his concept of like a big idea was very tied to like mathematical complexity, right? So mathematically complex ideas are those big ideas for him. And I don't want to throw a bomb in this community that I love, but I think we should be more sensitive to the limitations of constructionism and why perhaps it's not more widely adopted, and maybe come up with some new terminology to address some of those limitations in a forthright way. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Leah. So we are right on time. And so I want to first say we have many more questions, 12 questions that are unanswered. So I will email them to you, and then feel free to answer them to the attendees or find another way to get in touch with them. But I want to thank you so much for being here today. This is such an important topic, and I think we need to have more and more moments for talking about those things openly, and finding ways to, as you know, we also discussed today, to really go to our public schools, go to our communities, wherever they are, and bring our knowledge, and also, as we discussed, not just bring our knowledge, but also understand the power relations that are embedded in those ideas, and create more democratic environments and approaches to working with communities. So thank you very much. And now we're going to the full paper and the educator panels that you can find the links on the Canvas site. But thanks a lot, and I will see you around. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.